this paper that I'm looking at is about the relationships between intelligence services of foreign states and how intelligence liaison can influence national policy and I think even international diplomacy or the circumstances around it. The connections between intelligence services and are an important state-to-state relationships in diplomacy, and I think we can today look at some of the things we've covered. For instance, take for instance the Five Eyes intelligence sharing alliance of English-speaking states, led by the USA and the UK, and the impact that we've even talked about today that it can have on strategy and diplomacy across governments and around the world. For instance, like looking at the West's ability to shape its support for Ukraine and the existence of the Five Eyes within that larger structure. Or if you want to look just more broadly at kind of intelligence figures more broadly in diplomacy, we've seen the director of the CIA just recently sent to the Middle East, as he's been sent elsewhere in a really forward-facing role in his role in the Biden administration. Yet despite the importance of these relationships of intelligence officers and agents with other states, I find that we really don't see enough about them. They're very difficult to examine. And they're some of the most secretive things that governments conduct. And so I think details around intelligence liaison can really often be guarded as jealously as other forms of diplomatic and strategic engagement. So as an intelligence historian, and one particularly focuses on signals intelligence and communications intelligence, I went to the archives to see what I can try to dig up about these connections and what they can tell us about how they operate. This presentation tries to see how these intelligence files can illuminate the relations between allied intelligence services and intelligence officers. And because this is an Axon Johnson seminar, it makes an attempt at the end to try to draw these insights towards the contemporary and towards what we're seeing today and what sort of questions we need to ask about intelligence sharing, for instance, like with Ukraine. So for this presentation, I want to glance briefly at two relationships during another conflict, the Second World War. And those relationships are the one between Britain and the United States and Britain and France. Now, documents can tell us a lot about these relationships in different ways, but for my money anyway, intelligence material really highlights a few key aspects of intelligence liaison that constantly come home to me. And these are things like circumstances, for instance, how these relationships come about, what drives them, the interest that brings these groups together, the role of culture in how these relationships shape, both individual or institutional, and also, but for me, it's always the personal relationships that come out in the SIGINT and communications files that always comes home to me. That's something that I've really wanted to explore, and how this seems to allow diplomatic liaison to proceed. So on the first point, we know that the Second World War was the crucible that formed the Anglo-American special relationship and really formed that special intelligence side of the relationship, especially working, as we know, on some of the most secret material that was produced during the war. But the Anglo-American relationship that we know today wasn't preordained. It wasn't always destined. And in fact, before France fell to defeat in June 1940, the Franco-British intelligence relationship was set to develop on much the same lines or towards a very similar level of intimacy. And this really matters. Going back to my thing about personal relationships, we really see this in how relationships continued during the Second World War, even after the fall of France, between largely individuals who knew each other before, worked together during the interwar period, and maintained those connections even after France is occupied. So we know that circumstances matter, and in forcing the French out, in bringing the Americans in. But other factors matter too. Establishing the UK-USA relationship was itself a learning process, and we've got people here in this audience who have done much to expand our understanding of that. The internal research histories of the US National Archives give a sense of the American view of this process, and I really find them quite interesting. They underscore how cultural differences shaped personal and professional working relationships. For instance, in kind of looking at the development of the SIGINT relationship after the war, American officers recognized that Brits had different training methods than Americans. A lot of this training took place over tea and kind of unconventional conversations for unconventional work. And we see, just to underline the difference, over tea and cookies rather than tea and biscuits, written by the Americans. So you can see already these cultural differences are present all the way down. this wasn't really comprehensive enough for some American officers who would have liked a bit more. American officials also noted that even the relatively close cultural backgrounds of Americans and Brits wasn't enough to stop misunderstandings in the practice of their work. For instance, one example is when a British officer described that a fuel depot disposed of a certain amount of fuel, and the American officer didn't understand that that amount of fuel was available at that fuel depot. It was important for liaison officers to be able to work in different cultures, even ones so close as British and American, because officers who could do this were singled out in these records as noted for their success. So then, records underscore the importance of circumstances, the role of culture, to just in this 30,000-foot view. But one aspect of intelligence liaison that really always sticks with me is these personal relationships. I want to use the rest of my time to look at a couple of examples of how intelligence records underscore the importance of relationships between intelligence officers, and how these, I think, really have the potential to impact wider relations. Now, to do this, we're going to look at two pieces of communications intelligence or comment from the National Archives at Kew in West London. And this is a special form of comment. This is a general list of SIGINT produced by what is now the Government Communications Headquarters in the UK. But the comment we're looking at to look at the Franco-British relationship is the intercepted correspondence of Allied states. This is incredibly sensitive material, and even figures like the head of the British Secret Intelligence Service, Major General Stuart Menzies, or C, he knew that spying on allies, spying on friends, was some of the most sensitive work that British Secret Services undertook. So, some of you may be familiar with Franco-British relations during the Second World War, and especially perhaps those between Prime Minister Winston Churchill and General Charles de Gaulle. These were stormy, to say the least, and relations were often near breaking. One crisis in 1943 was over the decision by the French Committee of National Liberation to arrest a number of former Vichy French officials who had assisted with to some degree in the Allied invasion of North Africa. And part of the dispute is that Prime Minister Churchill and President Franklin Roosevelt felt that the Allies owed a bit of a debt to these figures. So this becomes a huge diplomatic rupture, and as we see, as the crisis was kicking off, the French intelligence leader, codenamed Colonel Passy, a Gaullist intelligence leader, he cables from Algiers to his subordinate in London. A great political crisis is brewing, he says. The British and the American ambassadors just made a joint effort to secure the release of these arrested officials. However, despite the threat that relations would be severed, the committee did not back down. However, so that's what we already know kind of about this operation, but this gives us a bit more insight into the intelligence side of things and functioning. The political crisis was also threatening intelligence cooperation. All flights to London had been stopped, and this was impacting the French secret services as well, who needed to get into metropolitan France, etc. Passy had arranged for some of his officers to fly with the English out of Marrakesh, the English of MI6, he says, out of Marrakesh, to carry on their work. However, he told his subordinate to go see Claude Danzy, Menzies' deputy and second in command of MI6. And Passy told him, as part of this, to tell him specifically, ask him to give orders so that my staff can move easily in both directions, and emphasize my personally very friendly relations towards him. Please, in the midst of this political crisis, tell him how much I like him and get us some help here. So in this first cable of two, we get a sense of how diplomatic crises could, of course, derail intelligence liaison, but we also see the importance of personal relations and the way that intelligence relationships had the potential to sustain state-to-state cooperation, even amid political crises. Now, let's take a look at an even more special cable, this time emphasizing how intelligence relations have the capacity to shape strategy and statecraft. This is a cable sent on 7 February 1945. It is a message from French intelligence in London to the leaders of the French Secret Service back in Paris, which has now been liberated, and so they're back home. And so this is from one of Passy's lieutenants back to Colonel Passy and other leaders in Paris. So why is it so special? This cable relayed important information delivered by the head of MI6, Stuart Menzies, to the top French leaders and even directed towards people like Charles de Gaulle. The cable's importance can be seen from the very first line. Absolutely secret. Very important to not distribute. The timing was critical. Mengi's gave this information through a verbal conversation with French intelligence officials the day before, on 6th February, just as the Yalta Conference is going on in faraway Crimea, Ukraine. And there, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Joseph Stalin are deciding large parts of the post-war world. Mengi's addressed issues that were front and center for French diplomacy, strategy, and intelligence. This included the occupation of Germany and whether France was going to have an occupation zone and thereby kind of look like a bit of a victorious power, as well as Allied relations with the Soviet Union and the place of intelligence in those relations. And we look at this message, it is clear that Mengi's wanted to shape French diplomacy, and more, that he understood intelligence relations to be an important part of how those relations operated. Mengi started with the intelligence relationship with the Russians, and that was bad. The Soviet services, he said, shared basically nothing with the Anglo-Americans, and these poor intelligence relations really contributed to fears about Russian intentions in the post-war world, beyond just their intelligence relationship. Mengi's greatly feared, the French officer reported, that the Russians would refuse to cooperate in the occupation, and that German agents would take refuge in the Soviet zone and avoid the Anglo-American secret services. Mengi's feared disaster in Germany as a result of this. But this is where the French came in. Mengi's promised the French that he would fight hard for the project of a French occupation zone. Why? Because he was going to depend on the French to force confessions out of prisoners. According to Mengi's, the British interrogation method was one of persuasion and sweetness, yielding results only at the end of several months. And this just wouldn't do in the circumstances. Mengi's was, quote, in favor of more energetic methods, employing, I say, the threat of torture. I repeat, the threat of torture. So Mengi's told the French that he had been promised, in fact, a free hand in this operation by Allied military leaders, including the Chief of Staff to General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander. But nevertheless, he was going to rely on the French and their enthusiasm to get quick results from captured agents. So the French officer understood the importance of what Mengi's had told him through this conversation. Allied relations with Russia were not good, and the British were pessimistic. This had consequences for the French as well, who had recently signed, less than 2 months before, a Franco-Soviet alliance with the Soviet Union. Quote, Mengi's voluntarily gave me these confidences to show me that the Franco-Soviet pact has surprises for us and is perhaps not the success we believe. The officer recommended that French intelligence support Mengi's and collaborate with the British Secret Services in intelligence missions in Germany. So this is even when you read 7,000 of these in a sitting, this is a pretty big one that strikes out. A lot of it is much more run-of-the-mill, although when you're mining it, you draw a lot of this stuff about personal relations and you get to build this larger thing. But this is, of course, a dramatic one. It offers incredible insight into the way that statecraft and diplomacy shaped intelligence relationships and targets, but it also offers important evidence of the role that intelligence liaison and the personal relationships through which these function can shape attitudes around international diplomacy itself, at least among senior leaders with influence. Look at how, for instance, for Mengi's, poor Allied relations with the Soviets was revealed in part by poor relations around intelligence. This contributed to a low level of trust, and it served to exacerbate anxiety about Russian intentions. But some of the biggest part here is, when it comes to diplomacy, is Mengi's reference to the Franco-Soviet pact. And it was a clear effort by Mengi's to warn the French against getting too close to the Russians and try to build a bit of a wedge that perhaps he felt was growing, and using intelligence relations as a key part of that. But if there's something I want us to take away from this cable, it's the way it underscores the importance of personal relationships by highlighting the trust involved. The contents of this cable were incredibly sensitive, and they would have been damaging to British or American diplomacy or security had they been released. That Mengi's was willing to release this type of information in this speaks to the high stakes, as well as a level of trust in his interlocutors, a level of trust that contrasts sharply with that he didn't have with the Soviets. So I know I'm finishing up here, but just to conclude, I promise to draw things back to contemporary conflict very briefly, a page I've missed here. And the war in Ukraine has seen an incredible amount of intelligence sharing between the UK and the USA, Five Eyes countries, and to a partner outside the Five Eyes. This research makes it clear that historians looking at contemporary intelligence relationships would do well to look at not just what material was shared or what institutional processes were established, but most of all, that scholars should examine both how material may have shaped diplomatic decision-making, but also the way that personal relationships in these processes may have shaped the larger relationships within diplomacy. Thank you very much, and I appreciate your time.